avui estem sentint, el que avui estem vivint, doncs genera una quantitat d'idees espectaculars. No sé si això acaba de funcionar gaire bé. Se sent aquest micro? Sí? El micro se sent. Va, és que jo em sento... Va, perfecte. Molt bé, ja hi som, portem molts mesos preparant aquest esdeveniment i amb el nostre president d'honor, amb el Federico Mayor Zaragoza, ens hem anat trobat moltes vegades a Barcelona i a Madrid per centrar com hauria de ser un espai, una trobada que es digués Talent for Peace. I quin seria el sentit d'aquest Talent for Peace? Partint de la premissa de que el talent és una llavor que tots nosaltres portem a dins el dia que naixem, és una llavor que no tothom la sap identificar ni té la sort d'identificar-la, però alguns la saben identificar, la saben regar, la saben fer créixer i normalment aquests talents o aquest talent de cada una de les persones, que cadascú té el seu, està acompanyat d'uns valors que són els que fan que la humanitat avanci en positiu. L'altra energia, la contrària, l'altra manera de moure el món és la manca de talent. La manca de talent es caracteritza per la por, perquè qui no es coneix, qui no té un objectiu, perquè no sap què ha vingut a fer en aquest món i a més no té els valors que acompanyen aquesta feina, normalment el que té és por. I quan actua la por, actua la guerra, actua la desconeixença, la desconfiança i finalment el conflicte. I partint d'aquesta petita premissa vam decidir que valia la pena fer aquesta trobada aquest any i desviar el nostre nucli de cada any del nostre Congrés de Talent i Coneixement per focalitzar-lo, per posar-lo al servei de la pau. Que m'acompanyi el Federico Mayor Zaragoza avui aquí és un honor immens, però també ho és i molt en Jerry Jacobs. Jerry Jacobs presideix la World Academy of Art and Science, que és una acadèmia que a nivell global es dedica precisament a coordinar el món de les ciències i de les arts per fer un món millor. Per tant, jo, de totes les coses que he anat sentint, m'havia fet un guió, m'havia preparat preguntes, m'havia preparat moltes coses, porto molt temps donant-li voltes, però crec que el millor que podem fer és fluir. Fluir perquè hem estat parlant abans de venir aquí i vosaltres teniu molta experiència, sobretot teniu molt de coneixement i crec que ens podeu aportar molt més que no que jo ara us faci una pregunta o una altra. Però, com a punt de partida, creieu que el talent és la solució als conflictes? Si vols, comenci vostè, senyor Jacobs.
I might say that the solution to conflicts is the condition for talents, rather than vice versa. I'll tell you why I start there. Back in 1960, there was an experiment done by psychologists in San Francisco. And they were trying to study the phenomenon that they called late blooming. Late blooming in psychology means a child who has an innate potential, but in the early years of life doesn't bring it out. And for a teacher, the greatest challenge is, how do I know whether a poor performing student is really just below average, or whether there's something blocking the release of their talent? So psychologists went into a school in San Francisco, and they said, we have developed a new test to identify late bloomers. And they distributed the test and applied it to all the children in several grades, lower grades of the school. And they went back and they tore up the tests and threw them away. And in a random way, they assigned scores to the students. And they went back to the principal of the school and they said, we've identified students who have latent untapped potential. And the principal distributed all this information to the teachers. And they came back at the end of a year and they did a further test of the achievements of the students, and they found, guess who were the students who performed the best, increased and improved the most during the year? it was the ones who had been identified as late bloomers, which was purely, of course, a random process. And what they concluded from this was that one of the greatest determinants of the students' performance and improvement was the attitude of the teacher to them and the attention they gave. Which in principle means, and I believe this principle in all the work I've done the last 40 years, every individual has latent talents, untapped talents. There's no individual with whom we fully develop the talents. And one of the keys, not the only key, but a starting point is a condition in life, a condition from the environment, the social environment in which they are, that believes in that. And of course, in an affectionate family or in a family of high achievers, they love to believe that the child has hidden potentials and they're constantly trying to encourage it. But there are many families and many communities in which the situation is so difficult that it's very difficult for them to give that attention to the children. So I'd like to link this opening comment to what we've been hearing about peace and the relationship between peace and security and talent and human development. And that's why I turned around, Brew, your question, and I said, I think the security is the foundation. There is a minimum level of security which people need before they can think about their higher aspirations, before they can think about tapping and developing new potentials. And that's true before the society can also think about tapping those potentials. And that's why in the World Academy of Art and Science, we're working with the United Nations Trust Fund on Human Security on a global campaign on the simple issue of human security for all. Human security as the basic condition for bringing out human talents and development of human potential. And by that we mean not the security that we get by building nuclear weapons and large militaries to prevent foreign invasion. There may be a place for that in certain circumstances, but I'm talking about what makes us feel secure. And there's something very puzzling about life today, because we have more. The world today has more wealth, has more knowledge, has actually, apart from places of violence, has lower mortality rates, longer life, less violence. Believe it or not, in spite of the fact that we hear it on the TV and watch it all the time in the media, and yet our levels of insecurity are rising. And when that insecurity, and that's what we're talking about today, whether we're talking about war or talking about AI, we're anxious. We're wondering what's happening to us. And when that anxiety is there, it's very difficult to think about developing your human potential. So this campaign is, what are the basic needs for human security for each of us? Depending on where we live, depending on the level of our life, it may be just food. For many, regardless of where they live or regardless how old they are, it may be health problems that create insecurity. The environment is a huge source of insecurity and anxiety today. According to the World Health Organization, environmental climate change is the single greatest threat to human health. And it's going to keep growing over the years. And then there's the safety of a community. If you live in a community, regardless of what country it is, whether it's whether it's guns in America or guns in some other place, and then there's the cybersecurity, whether when we're using our connection or we're getting an email or a phone call, is this somebody's trying to tap in and rob us or not? And the whole environmental security and all. So I'm trying to link this to the issue of talent and peace. There is a foundation, and I'll stop here, but there is a foundation that if you look at the real causes of instability and the real causes of violence, it's almost in every case where it's not just sheer aggression for the sake of aggression, it's because of a sense of insecurity. And the best remedy to create that environment of peace in the world is not another $2 trillion in military spending every year. It's certainly not more nuclear weapons and bigger armaments. It's to raise the basic human security in communities of people all over the world. And that's the campaign that we're working on.
Federico, hem estat parlant abans molta estona, pensant una miqueta cap a on volíem portar la nostra conversa, però jo crec que tu probablement has viscut o ets la persona, almenys nascuda aquí a Barcelona, que ha tingut l'oportunitat de viure processos de pau al més altíssim nivell a nivell mundial. Has viscut amb les persones que prenien decisions, amb tot el que duien al darrere i que els condicionava, i has pogut viure l'ànima humana davant del conflicte més gran que pot haver patit mai la humanitat, que era un conflicte tan gran com el de l'època de la Guerra Freda, i vas viure la seva resolució, aparent resolució en aquell moment. Quina esperança podem donar de la teva experiència a les nostres generacions, als nostres fills?
Bueno, aquesta tarda aquí n'heu donat moltes i el primer que jo vull fer és felicitar-vos al Global Peace Forum, al José Félix, felicitar-te a tu per unir la creativitat, el talent, que és absolutament necessari, però jo crec que ara la meva recomanació seria, primer, sentir coses molt certes i molt importants en relació a solucions possibles a uns problemes que des de fa segles, no anys, segles, estan condicionant la vida humana, la vida dels sers humans. I per això jo el que us recomanaria seria que miréssiu de poder resumir. Ja saps que jo soc molt resumidor, perquè si no, si fem aquestes manifestacions molt llargues i tal, no serveixen per res. Hi ha que dir d'una manera molt clara, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 coses, i s'ha acabat. Però, torno a repetir, avui jo aquí he sentit no només un anàlisi crític molt ben fet, sinó sobretot que hi ha que portar solucions. I que aquestes solucions estan dintre d'aquesta capacitat, que és la nostra esperança, que cada ser humà és capaç de crear. Cada ser humà, això és una meravella, cada ser humà és capaç de crear. I això és el que hem de dir i avui hem de proclamar aquí, perquè és Talentum per la pau, que només d'aquesta manera serem capaços de trobar solucions a problemes que des de fa tants anys estan i que jo em coneixo molt bé perquè he tingut ocasió de viure-los i a més d'estar molt a prop, a vegades, de la solució. Però immediatament el que està clar és que estem en un sistema des de l'origen del temps, on només val la força. La força també dels diners, però sobretot la força militar. Si vis pacem, para bellum. Si vols la pau, prepara la guerra. I això ho hem estat fent durant segles. Sempre han sigut homes els que han tingut aquest poder absolut i han manat i han dit, si vols la pau, prepara la guerra. Vinga, això, pam, guanyem. Sempre per la força. Sempre per la força. I ara arriba un moment en què un diu, bueno, hem de mirar aviam que hi hagin solucions, que poguéssim tindre aquestes open arms per tothom, que els braços serveixin per solucionar els problemes amb una nova manera de veure els problemes i de veure les coses i que no tornéssim a veure les mans alçades, sinó les mans esteses i les mans obertes per l'ajut i que poguéssim tindre aquest nou concepte de seguretat del que ens parlava el Gary Jacobs, que és enormement important. Jo tinc, precisament això ho havia estudiat jo molt, vaig estudiar un nou concepte de seguretat ja fa temps i vaig arribar a la conclusió de que el nou concepte de seguretat que podria realment canviar les coses seria el human security, la seguretat humana. Clar, no pot ser que estiguéssim sempre parlant de seguretat a base de més bombes, a base de més capacitat. I ara es parla altra vegada inclús de la possibilitat d'utilitzar, almenys com amenaça, d'utilitzar la bomba atòmica. Però què és això? Però com ho podem estar tolerant, això? I ho estem tolerant per què? Perquè hem acceptat progressivament que ens treguin tot el poder a la societat civil. El poder està sempre de la part de paravellum. En vez de paraverbum, para la paraula, que és la mediació, que és la manera de negociar, paravellum, només la força, sempre només la força. La força també, com us deia, dels diners. Avui estem, des de l'any 86 exactament, amb què Reagan va crear el G6, estem en un sistema, el sistema del G6, del G7, del G8, del G20, que és un sistema plutocràtic, un sistema basat en molts de diners, i supremacista. Hi ha uns països que tenen més capacitat que els altres i són els que manen. Per què no podem solucionar les coses? Per què no podem, quan Òscar ens ha parlat de tot el d'Open Arms, per què no podem dir no, ho anem a solucionar? Si resulta que hi ha molts de diners i resulta que hi ha moltes forces. Per què? Doncs perquè estem sotmesos amb un sistema que, fixeu-vos, l'any 1919 ja va haver un president nord-americà que a l'acabar la guerra, la Primera Guerra Mundial, que va ser un desastre, els soldats no morien de bombes, morien de peste, morien de fred, morien de fam. I tenen un president nord-americà, el Wilson, que és un senyor que diu, no, això no pot ser. En aquell moment no hi havia avions, agafa un barco, va des de Nova York a Brest, des de Brest se'n va a París, a la Concòrdia, i ensenya la pau permanent. A partir d'ara s'ha acabat la força, a partir d'ara la paraula, a partir d'ara la mediació, a partir d'ara la negociació, a partir d'ara la conversació, i crea la societat de nacions. Havia una solució. Torna als Estats Units i els republicans primer l'aparten del poder, però a més es dona l'immensa incoherència. Això són les coses que ara hem de recordar. L'immensa incoherència de que l'Estat de Nord-Amèrica, que és el que crea la societat de nacions, mai va formar part de la societat de nacions i va deixar un món absolutament dislocat on els alemans podien tornar a fer les barbaritats que havien fet a la Primera Guerra Mundial, i va haver, l'any 1933, ja estava el Hitler amb el seu Mein Kampf, i dius, però com pot ser això? Doncs pot ser perquè es va procurar que no pogués haver la solució de la paraula, la solució de la intel·ligència, la solució de buscar realment aquells... I a més és això, aquells mitjans de nou talent, de sabidoria, de sagessa. Per cert, quan es parla d'educació, això ho he estudiat una mica perquè he estat a l'UNESCO durant 12 anys, però quan es parla d'educació hay que anar molt al tanto, perquè immediatament parlem de que si l'anglès, de que si els idiomes, de que si les matemàtiques... No. Això no té res a veure amb educació. L'educació és afavorir precisament el que aquesta capacitat distintiva de l'espècie humana, que és la capacitat creadora, que és el talent, es pugui desenvolupar. Això és l'educació. I això vol dir que no sapiguer matemàtiques o sapiguer idiomes. A l'article primer de la UNESCO, de la Constitució de l'UNESCO, diu: els educats són els que són lliures i responsables. Clar, això és el que hem de ser. Hem de ser tots els ciutadans lliures, que és el gran do. I després hem de ser responsables. No pot ser que siguéssim irresponsables, com ara passa, perquè això, cada any anem acceptant que es facin, en vez de esforços cap a la negociació i cap a la protecció del planeta, la protecció de la Terra, estem favorint que passi el contrari. Ara mateix, què és el que ha passat? Com pot ser que havent creat unes Nacions Unides, que són una perfecció? Escolteu, des d'un punt de vista de capacitat d'evitar confrontaments i d'evitar guerres, és fantàstic. El disseny que va fer Roosevelt va ser molt bo i, a més, va fer una altra cosa que en aquell moment era extraordinària. Va nomenar una dona per presidir la Declaració dels Drets Humans. Doncs bé, el mateix dia que es va crear les Nacions Unides a San Francisco, el mateix dia es va posar 5 vetos dels 5 països que havien sigut els guanyadors de la guerra. S'havia acabat. Fa 78 anys, carall, que les Nacions Unides no han pogut aplicar la Carta a les Nacions Unides. I llavors parlem molt que si el secretari general... Però si som nosaltres els que hem acceptat durant 78 anys que aquesta cosa que comença dient, la Carta comença dient nosaltres els pobles, hem resolt evitar als nostres fills l'horror de la guerra. No s'ha pogut aplicar mai. I és un desastre. Jo ho he viscut, això, molt directament. Tu ho saps, he estat en diversos processos de PAUEX. I dius, al final sempre passa el mateix. Tenim que aplicar, que ara som nosaltres els pobles, perquè fins fa poc no podíem, perquè érem tot homes i, a més, la dona estava discriminada. Ara que ens reconeixem iguals, amb dignitat, ara que ja puguem expressar-nos perquè gràcies a la tecnologia digital podem expressar-nos, ara ja podem participar, ara ja podem ser nosaltres els pobles, ara ja podem, i per això ens hem d'unir la World Forum amb el WPF i hem de fer que hi hagi una capacitat molt gran per nosaltres, els pobles, finalment poder expressar-nos. I acabo dient una cosa. El que ens quedava com a solució, i sempre dèiem, bueno, al final potser Europa, perquè hi havia aquests països del nord d'Europa que eren exemplars, perquè Europa tenia, des del moment que es va fundar el Tractat de Roma, tenia aquesta capacitat de dir no, hi ha uns principis que són intocables, això no es pot. Doncs ens quedava, jo me'n recordo quan l'any 2003 el president aquest del Bush Júnior va invadir Iraq, en aquell moment Europa encara existia. Hi va haver un senyor que era el president de França, Jacques Chirac, en aquell moment, que va anar i va dir no, en nom d'Europa, això, en nom d'Europa, jo dic que no, i que tal. Això s'ha acabat. Què és el que ens està passant? Què és el que ens està passant? Que ara mateix la senyora van der Leyen, que és una senyora molt preparada, no pot fer res. Per què? Perquè li han col·locat, com a les Nacions Unides, a la Unió Europea, li han col·locat els vetos. El veto que és encara pitjor, perquè són els vetos de tots els països, perquè és la unanimitat. I la unanimitat, deia el meu professor de filosofia aquí a Barcelona, el Francesc Gomà, deia, Frederic, l'antítesi de la democràcia és la unanimitat. Doncs ara estem a l'antítesi. Hem d'acabar amb l'antítesi. I només es pot acabar pel talent. I només es pot acabar per la sabidoria. Només es pot acabar per la capacitat creadora. Hem de buscar fórmules per acabar amb aquesta incapacitat de les Nacions Unides i de les organitzacions com la Unió Europea per poder actuar. I una altra cosa, finalment, però m'empipa molt, quan veig que em diuen han arribat a consensos, han arribat a compromisos, amb la COP, això de la COP, sobre el medi ambient, i llavors a continuació diuen però no són vinculants. Home, que no ens preguin el pèl, un compromís no vinculant no és un compromís. Per tant, bueno...
Veig que no només de les teves paraules, sinó de paraules que he sentit abans que pugéssim ara aquí, un cert desànim que genera, per exemple, el que ara deies tu, d'aquesta, i abans l'Òscar Camps ho apuntava, la societat civil ha desaparegut. També algú deia que les noves generacions sembla que no hi són, que no estan reivindicant, no estan al front de posar el crit al cel i dir volem la pau, volem intervenir, volem dir la nostra. No? Dóna la sensació de que vivim una anestèsia general, no? Substituïda a la societat civil per grans mitjans de comunicació, segurament al servei de grans poders que probablement són sempre els mateixos. I clar, això faria pensar que potser no val la pena lluitar i tirar la tovallola, però com que estic al costat de dos grans lluitadors, la meva pregunta és com despertem a la societat civil, com fem que aquesta llavor de talent exploti i planti cara. Jerry.
I understand your comment, Brew, because these are really times of confusion and high anxiety and a high level of insecurity. And I'd like to go back and try to comment on that, because as far as civil society goes, I think if you actually check the data, that the global system of civil society is stronger and more active than it has ever been in history, and more interconnected. And we work at the international level. One of our partners is Congo. It's the Confederation of NGOs that are affiliated directly with the UN, very large NGO, 600, there are 3,000 of them all over the world, we happen to be one, who are working day and night on collaboration. We are working day and night on collaboration with the Interparliamentary Union, which is 170 parliaments of the world, the Inter-Academy Partnership of 140 national academies of the world, and we're just a drop in an ocean. I think global civil society has never been as advanced as it is today. But at the same time, the speed of change is so fast, and the level of information and misinformation, disinformation, dissemination is so great that we miss the progress, and we're more and more aware of the problems. It's not that we read about a war 3 weeks later. We see it on the news or on the internet every morning or every evening when we look at it. It's just in our face all the time. I'd like to go back, if I could, to a couple of very important of the many comments that Federico Mayor made. One was the word responsibility, and it was also mentioned in some of the earlier sessions that we heard here. Very interesting discussion. That word really rings deeply with me and with the World Academy, because we were founded on the basis of that word responsibility by very eminent scientists in the world, people like Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer, who was actually called the father of the Manhattan Project that created the atomic bomb. And if you look at this in a historical perspective, you see it a little differently. In the middle of World War II, scientists, I'm talking now in America, but there were many European scientists like Einstein who were working there, really believed that there was an urgent need to develop an atomic weapon before Germany developed it, and Germany had been working on it for more than a year. And so the scientists thought they were doing the most proper thing, dedicating their knowledge to try to do this to protect the free world from the consequences. And they did develop the bomb, as we all know, before Germany did. But by that time, Germany had surrendered. And so the war in Europe was over. And what possible need could be to use it? But the political decision made in the United States was that the cost of getting Japan to surrender would be so horrendous in terms of loss of lives that the president and the political system decided to use the bomb anyway, which was to great reluctance of the scientists who had developed it. After all, can't we just wait a little longer until we finish the war? And after the two bombs had been dropped, the scientists went to the government, went to the president and said, this technology is too dangerous for anybody to have or use in the future. And the only way to stop it is for us to declare now unilaterally that we will destroy our weapons and join in a global peace treaty. Back in 1945, this was a global peace treaty to prohibit the development of nuclear weapons. Way back then, the scientists said, and the governments, the politicians in many countries said, no, this is too powerful and too important an item to just put away like this. And we know the result. The result was a nuclear arms race, which is still going on. We thought it was over in 1991, and now it's again starting up. And this was a very important point in history, because for the first time in history, the scientific community realized that it commanded the greatest power in the world. Science had been working in an ivory tower. They'd been doing their fundamental research in universities and research institutes, but never thinking that they were wielding the greatest power in the world. And now the question was, what should they do about it? And so during the 1950s, when the Cold War really gained momentum and when the arms race really accelerated, the scientists came together from many different countries in Europe, in the United States, and in some other places also, and decided we have to take responsibility. We cannot say that we're not responsible for what happens just because we didn't set it off and we didn't want to set it off. We have developed it. And that led to many developments, and one of them was the founding of the World Academy of Art and Science by these eminent people in 1960 on the basis that science has a responsibility for the consequences of the work it did. Now, if you flash forward 60 years, we have a new scientific technology of unprecedented potential for good or potential for the other, enough to make us all a little anxious and insecure. And of course, I'm talking about artificial intelligence, which we heard a very interesting discussion about. And it's very interesting because the scientists didn't take a decade to begin speaking out. The loudest voice about the potential misuse of artificial intelligence has come from the authors, the scientists, the technologists who've developed it, and realized that we cannot step back and not take responsibility. And I think it's important for us to understand that the world we are learning something. Whether we're learning it fast enough to keep up with the relative development of technology and everything is another question. But that sense of responsibility is really critical. About 4 years ago, we conducted a conference with IEEE. I don't know, some of you may be familiar with the organization. It's the largest organization of electronic engineers in the world, about 500,000 from all over the world. And they educate, and they very progressive organization. And we had a big conference in Italy with their AI division. And we asked the heads of the organization, how much are you doing to teach your students about the social implications of the technology they're developing? It's one thing you're teaching them how to write code and develop AI programs, but how much do they understand about the potential upside and the downside of the technology? And this was now, I think this was now 5 years ago, and they said, they don't learn anything about that in our technical education because the technical education is separate from everything else. 6 months ago, we conducted a conference in which Federico Mayor was one of our keynote speakers in the opening session on education for human security. And we had a broad representation of academics from 25 different disciplines, everything from business and technology and law and environment to English literature, economics, political science, and the humanities, anthropology, and the arts. And we asked each of the groups, tell us how much through an education in your field a student is learning about what it takes to create human security for themselves and for the community and for the people they work with and for the world we live in. And it was extremely challenging because virtually all of them realized and recognized that they never thought that was their job. They never thought it was their job. No, we teach English, or we teach art, or we teach business. We teach people how to make money or run financial systems and everything. And that shows something, what I was trying to illustrate about science. Science was not unique. One of the tendencies of us as a species is that we divide reality into so many compartments, and we focus exclusively on one piece of the big puzzle. Human security can only be achieved when we understand the whole picture, and when we're educated to live in a society in which all of these dimensions, the food, the health, the environment, the economic dimension, the political dimension of human rights, the community development, unless we are educated to understand the whole complexity of the world we live in. And that's the real, instead of looking for the enemy, I think the enemy is our ignorance. The enemy is because we haven't yet learned to think holistically in an integrated way. Education's the most powerful. I think it's the greatest creation humanity's ever invented, way beyond AI. But we're learning still, after how many thousands of years, how to educate ourselves and how to educate the next generation and how to prepare the next generation for a world we don't know what it's going to be. We don't know what skills they're going to need. We don't know what the conditions are going to be. We are still learning as a species. And I think the critical need for us, we can solve our problems, but we have to start with the foundation. And the foundation is the education of the next generation, not to be smarter computer programs than we are, or better mathematicians or anything else, but to be better, understand this complex world in which we live better than we do now, than our leaders do now. And as much as we may complain, and we all complain about our leaders, whether they're at the national level or at the international level, what is the education they got? That prepared them to take responsibility. Imagine the Secretary General of the UN being prepared to handle the phenomenon of artificial intelligence when it suddenly explodes on the surface and is identified by experts as the greatest threat, or climate change. We have a long way to go, but it's important for us to know the real points at which we need to work. We need to start thinking much more holistically. We need to be educating ourselves, not as specialists. I found a quote from Buckminster Fuller, who was one of the founders of the World Academy, and he says, specialization in education has been the source of all our problems. We're educating people for ignorance. Because the more we become specialized, the more we lose sight of the whole reality of the world in which we live. We can't afford to be educating either nuclear physicists who don't understand the potential dangers of the technology, or engineers in artificial intelligence who don't know the society and don't know the ways it can be used for good or for bad. And that's an evolutionary step we have to take. And I just add, because we had a very interesting discussion on AI, which touched many important dimensions, but I'd like to just throw out one more, because we've been thinking about it a lot in the Academy, and we've been asked by UNESCO to work on governance of AI. But it was interesting. I talked to a colleague of mine who works for an AI company in San Francisco. She happens to be of Indian origin. And she says, you know that the AI scientists in this company today are all talking about intuition. I said, that's a really interesting thing. There's so much fear in the world that the AI is going to overtake human beings and become more intelligent than we are. I think it's like saying that the cows and the horses that run our plows are going to eliminate our jobs plowing the fields, or the tractors that we get to plow our lands are going to eliminate our jobs running the bullock carts or the plows that do it. Our whole progress as human beings has to be kept to grow and develop higher levels of talent and capacity than what the previous generations had. We would hardly do anything that our forefathers did without thinking there's got to be a better way to do this. This is not the way women today, imagine them doing what my grandmother was doing. She was the generation got the first washing machines for clothes washing in the States. Imagine if women's lives were confined to the life of what it was. Even in India, where I live, no woman will grind the food by hand and everything, spend 3 hours in the morning cooking the food anymore because the technology has liberated them. But that's only half the story. The other half of the story is, what can we be doing that we're not doing now? What can we be developing of our capacities that we're not developing now? Albert Einstein said that all his greatest discoveries, all his valuable insights in science came when he stopped thinking. When he stopped exercising the rational faculty. And if you study the history of great inventions and great scientific discoveries, there's a lot of testimony that the great science has come through intuitive faculties. And yet the irony is, the one thing we don't teach in science or in any field that matter is how to develop intuition. We teach people how to repeat the same methods that have been done in the past. But it was interesting to me that now scientists in AI are beginning to think, all right, we're now developing a computer that can remember everything we forget and can compute faster than we'll ever compute. But they cannot do intuition. They cannot open to those higher faculties. This is an invitation to us to grow. And to do that, our educational system has to grow. We have to stop teaching students for what was needed 30 years ago or 60 years ago. When I was in school, we didn't have, we had slide rules. We didn't have calculators. We had to learn how to do square roots in ourselves. But today, all of that's not what we call education. So I think it's a question of our institutions catching up with the speed of development and catching up in finding the technology or the know-how to release the talents, the latent talents that are there in the human species. And I just close with this, that if you look, first generation, I've seen in India, for example, first generation students whose parents were completely uneducated, illiterate. But when they're given the right environment and the right education, they shine. Some of them, not all of them, some of them shine and they become stars in the field. One generation, because that potential was there, but it was never given. So the real technology we need for the future is the technology which we call education, of fully developing the talents of the human being. And nobody's ever been able to say that we have exhausted those talents or we even know what all of them are. We've got so much more to explore.
Sorry. Thank you very much. Bé, això, el temps passa volant, Federico, això va tota castanya, se'ns ha acabat el temps, però jo vull dir dues coses. Primer, agrair-vos molt, tu que hagis vingut des de Madrid, que no està tan lluny, i en Jerry, que thank you for coming from India.
Thank you for inviting me.
Jo vull dir una cosa que crec que és molt important per posar en context. Hem parlat molt de talent, hem parlat molt de què cal fer per intentar que el talent es pugui agrupar per millorar els grans reptes que té la humanitat, i avui es tracta de la pau, però la pau no hi és sense la justícia social, no hi és sense la justícia en general, no hi és sense el repartiment de la riquesa, no hi és sense moltes altres coses. I hem après moltíssimes coses. Però estem aquí avui amb un punt d'optimisme, perquè hem après també coses que poden ser guia per sortir-ne. I jo vull recordar dues persones que estan molt vinculades on estem ara. Una, tenim uns murals aquí, que abans ens deia la presidenta del Col·legi d'Arquitectes, que els va realitzar Picasso des de l'exili, mai va poder veure'ls realitzats físicament, però des del seu exili va voler representar la sardana, que és la dansa més vella de totes les danses que es fan i es desfan, que és el ball típic de Catalunya, i que el que fa és unir a les persones amb les mans, amb una rotllana, els diumenges després de missa. Molt bé. Aquesta és una de les coses que volia que t'emportessis a la Índia. L'altra és a Pau Casals. Hi vam inaugurar aquest congrés amb el seu cello, amb una gent d'aquí que reproduïa el seu himne, que va presentar ara fa 52 anys a Nacions Unides. I ell allà va parlar molt de pau, va parlar moltíssim de pau. Però ho va fer des d'un punt de vista també, com Picasso, d'exili, de persona que vivia fora del seu país, exiliat per una dictadura i per una situació molt, molt greu. I ho va fer parlant també de la nostra cultura i de la nostra història i el nostre vincle amb la pau. Va parlar de pau i treva, una eina de pau que va crear el mateix fundador de Montserrat, l'abat Oliva, fa ara més de 1000 anys. Va parlar del propi concepte de comerç a la Mediterrània. Nosaltres ara farem 750 anys que la nostra llotja a mar tenia els consolats de mar, que eren eines d'intercanvi al llarg de la Mediterrània i per tant eren eines de pau. Volem que te'n tornis al teu país per seguir liderant aquesta eina global que és l'entitat que presideixes, la Global Academy of Arts and Science, i que ho facis recordant que has estat en un lloc on ens estimem molt la pau, ens estimem molt el talent i que hem generat talent al llarg de la nostra història. I et convidem a que tornis a venir tant com puguis, i la nostra fundació serà una eina al vostre servei, el nostre focus al talent al servei de la pau. Moltes gràcies, Federico.
Només vull dir una cosa, perquè estem tots mirant a veure com podem canviar, sobretot l'atenció de la gent jove i tot això. I el que hem de tindre, per això tu ho saps, estic molt interessat des de fa ja més d'un any, sobre el deure de memòria. Hem de saber el que ha passat. I ho sabem, moltes coses les sabem però no les diem. Hem de saber el que ha passat. Per exemple, s'ha parlat aquí del poder nuclear. Hem de saber per què avui encara tenim 6.000 bombes a Rússia i 5.000 als Estats Units. I hem de saber per què es va passar això. I hem de saber per què les Nacions Unides no poden prendre mesures. I hem de saber qui ha fet que Europa avui no valgui res perquè no pot prendre decisions per l'unanimitat. Si sabem el que ha passat, podem corregir-ho. I la gent pot estar interessada en dir, caram, nosaltres també ara podem col·laborar si sabem el que ha passat. Per tant, deure de memòria és fonamental, jo us ho recomano molt, perquè tindríem que veure com la gent jove, al saber el que ha passat i el que pot passar, si no ho corregim, potser ja estigués més propensa a intervindre.
Moltes gràcies. Us convido que us quedeu a la següent part de la nostra jornada d'avui, que és el lliurament dels nostres premis d'honor. Sisplau, si voleu.